This week we have our last guest lecture for the semester. Robert Curgenven is an Australian-born artist and composer who currently resides in the Republic of Ireland. He was recently in Australia to perform his work Bronze Lands for pipe organ and sound system on the grand pipe organ at the Sydney Town Hall for the Sydney Festival. This work was the latest in a series of works exploring the physicality of organs as generators of fields of sound. As you will hear, the notion of sound in the field and sound fields is a central concern in his work. Like Jasmine Guffon, who we heard from last week, Robert Curgenven's work spans recorded music, installation and performance. However, in contrast to Jasmine's concern for the socio-political context of her work, Robert's work focuses on the physical properties of sounds and the spaces in which they occur. Robert's lecture includes a suggestion that we consider moving out of the recording studio with its artificially controlled neutral acoustics and embrace the richness of the acoustic environments or sound fields in which we may choose to record. You may like to spend some time looking at the material on Robert's website, recordedfields.net. I also suggest you look at the works of American artist James Turrell, who treats light in a similar way that Robert Curgenven treats sound. Robert's work CLIMATA has been designed for and recorded in 15 of James Turrell's sky spaces across 9 countries. Here is Robert Curgenven.
Hi, my name is Robert Curgenven, as introduced just now. I'm going to be giving a talk to you about sound, location, ontology, physicality and air today. Thought it worth beginning with an example. Alvin Lucier's I am sitting in a room different to the one that you are sitting in right now, because this is indeed very true, and the piece is very illustrative of the notion that we are aware of where we are spatially. Normally, I'd be giving a lecture, not sitting in a room in rural Ireland talking to a camera, but I would be sitting in a room shared by all of you. Now, you may or may not be aware of each other's presence, be it via the internet, email, whatever. I am presently sitting in an area without any internet. So, from the very beginning, there is a psychological, social, and physical disconnect between the reception of my voice as a sound and your social engagement with that as a sound through a spatial context of a group of people sitting in a room. The piece by Lucier involves playing the sound repeatedly of him saying that sentence, I am sitting in a room different to the one that you are sitting in right now, over and over again, and re-recording it from the room each time till you're basically just hearing the room harmonics and a whole series of noise that's caused by the flutters, fricatives, and all the different sounds specific to his speech, but also specific to the room. When we experience sound spatially, we're often listening to high-frequency dampening and early reflections. You're probably going to be listening to this on headphones, and I would recommend headphone listening, particularly for the examples that I'll be playing later. Another aspect that is coming into this is bitrate. So rather than hearing this as an analogous situation where you are literally hearing bits of meat making up my head, flapping around, causing sound to move over the vocal cords, you understand how it works, into a room, and that you are aware of each other in that room, and that you're aware of that sound moving around. That's all gone now. So in many aspects, today's lecture is going to be one of the simplest and probably one of the least technologically impressive ones that you're going to encounter for quite some time. But I'm going to try to make the most of a somewhat obtuse situation. So I'm particularly interested in the locational aspect of sound and also the context of the sound. So right now, both of those things have been stripped out. I can't point out the window and ask you to notice various things. I can't open the window and allow the air in from outside. At the moment, it's some 4 degrees outside. I'm in rural Ireland because I had to leave to get away from some problems at the moment that you might have noticed are causing changes to transportation and also the way that we associate socially. So even if we were in a room together, we'd be distancing ourselves from each other. you'd be noticing that there is a lot of dead air, so to speak, in the room. The context of this particular situation, where the air is a lot cooler than where you are sitting right now, you would be noticing that the fact is that the sound moves faster where you are. That between minus 40 and 40 degrees temperature, you're going to notice a 10% difference in the rate at which sound moves. So that the idea that you can play the same sound in any environment that sounds the same, when you're listening specifically to the propagation of the sound, there will be fundamental differences based on the temperature, humidity, and pressure. Now that these are going to become more important as we talk about different aspects of the way that I'm working with sound. I'm aware that there's students working from an orchestral background, from a technological background, and also from through music and the creative industries, going to try and weave all of these things together and at the same time maybe address none of them simultaneously. So you will become aware of the differences, but also the commonalities in these different aspects of practice. So firstly, back to the notion of sitting in a room. The room that you're sitting in right now is going to have very specific kind of spatial nodes. So we have Stickman here. He's standing in a room, and you'll notice that these rooms are attached to each other. So if you consider each of these rooms as a resonator, and within each resonator there's a different mode and a different node. Specifically, having a whole bunch of people in a room together, it's reflective not just on your social engagement, but your mode of being. That given that you haven't been traveling anywhere today and that you've probably been staying inside for quite some days, this is going to have quite an impact on your mode of being. You may or may not be more aware of the way in which sound is moving around in the room around you. So rather than just focusing on how sound came to be there, thinking about how sound and our reception of sound is reflective of our mode of being. That if you are out in the middle of the desert and you're making a field recording of, different animals and the wind moving around, it's not just the fact that you're there, but how you came to be there. Did you rent an expensive four-wheel drive and drive out there, make the recording and go back again? Or are you perhaps living there for a longer period of time? You're going to be noticing different things. You're going to be drawn to different aspects. And particularly if you're out there for quite some time, the air comes back into play again because you're really focused on the weather. You will go outside when it's warmer. You'll probably stay inside when it's raining or it's colder. So that these subtle things, temperature, pressure, humidity, are going to shape the way that we notice how sound moves, but also our engagement with the world at large, which is having an impact on sound. So our mode of being within a room is going to also give different coloration to the sound, depending on whereabouts in the room we are. If you were to take a simple example like a turntable, and that I'm using this as an example to notice how sound is colored by equipment. If you consider the turntable to be a series of nested resonators as well, the body of the turntable resonates at one frequency, the tone arm resonates at another frequency, and the head shell resonates at another frequency. Now, depending on where you place this setup with the speakers within the room, you're going to get different overtones. I've done a lot of work with turntables over the years, and I'm using the turntable as a set of nested resonators to produce feedback. Now, where you place the turntable in the room relative to the speakers, and also the shape of the room and the specific modes and nodes of the room, are going to make an impact on what kind of sustained feedback you get and the coloration of the overtones in that feedback. Now, we're not talking about the honking kind of sound. We're talking about the onset of an unstable steady state, which is kind of like an oscillation. Now, the turntable itself, the body is designed not to resonate, as I mentioned, and it tends to resonate around 30 hertz. So we're getting a very physical, very low frequency moving around in the room, something that you're often noticing specifically with your body. It's going to produce different fluttering effects depending on where you're standing. And then the higher feedback from the head shell and also the medium range tone from the tone arm is all going to produce different coloration. So rather than just thinking of you're playing even a blank record, the equipment itself is fundamentally changing the way that we hear sound. if I was to then play the same kind of setup in a much colder room, it's going to be up to 10% different depending on the temperature, and also the humidity. A more humid room, sound travels quicker in a more humid environment. So sound could literally sound more languid in a warmer, more humid room. So moving on to talking about further aspects of how the room functions and also how the overtones work, just a quick précis about context. So as we're all sitting in a room that's different to the one that each of us in turn is sitting in from each other right now, it's important to notice that sound moves within a field. So you've got height, depth, width, but it's also durational. So rather than just focusing on something that's moving within space or a volume of air, it's important to notice how that volume of air changes over a distinct period of time, and also how it changes relative to our attendance to it. So if we were all sitting in a room together right now, you'd be noticing that we're all respiring, slowly increasing the humidity, so that at the end of this hour, you would be noticing that it's considerably more humid than it was at the beginning. Sound will be traveling ever so slightly faster, and that you'll be noticing that this is kind of also having an effect on our corporeality. And we tend to have a response to more humid conditions. So rather than approaching things from the A is 440 at room pressure and temperature, and that we're working from concert pitch and all these sort of things, I'd like to encourage you to think of your instrument or the technology that you're using as not being as transparent as perhaps you imagine. That anything that you do or any kind of equipment that you use is inherently adding color. And where you make any recordings, like if it's not just plugged straight into the box, that will have a distinct influence on that as well. So, if you're recording in a bathroom, there's going to be a great deal of reverb, and then that's going to contribute to the sound. So rather than thinking of sound as just being inert or something that can be notated, timbre, of course, can't be notated, but everything kind of starts to spool out and become a little bit more complicated. So even though we're using very simple means of reproduction right now, the concepts start to get gradually more complicated as we look at them. So I'm going to start with the first example and something that draws all of these ideas together. Originally, I'm an organist, and if you consider pipes of the organ as each being a bunch of resonators that are moving air about, producing different overtones, and if you were to supply insufficient air to a pipe, then it's going to start to have different ciphers and undertones going on, and wolf tones, all these kind of things. So I was recording in a bunch of rural churches in Cornwall, so that just happens to be next landfall from where I'm sitting right now, in the room that is different to the one in which you are sitting. And if you consider also that these resonators are sitting within a church, in this case they were made of granite, and that has a specific influence on the way that the sound moves around in that environment. They're often quite damp and quite cold, so the air moves a little bit slower. If I was to play the same recordings back in a much warmer, less humid room, it would sound fundamentally different. So rather than focusing on producing notes, I'm producing sounds in a way, and it's literally through this movement of air. So we're going to listen to an example now where basically I've made recordings of holding down notes or keys on the keyboard, and I'm manipulating the stops so that there's different aspects to how the sound, the onset, and then the attack, sustain, decay, and release. You'll start to hear also how when the recordings are combined, the different notes are modulating each other. I'd suggest headphone listening for this particular part. And I've also put some pretty pictures in the background or in the foreground for you to look at while you're listening to this example. For those of you who, I'm not sure, if you need pictures, if you'd like to look at pictures, they were recorded in the area where the sound is recorded. They don't necessarily add anything to the experience of the sound. They're not necessarily edited to go with the sound. But rather than just have a blank screen and you all wander off and have a cup of coffee and miss the exciting sound, I thought I'd put something there. You can close your eyes. I'm not going to tell you what to do and how to enjoy yourselves. Okay, we're back now. Something that you may have noticed within those recordings is that they're very hissy. Hiss is quite important in as much as the sound above 4 kilohertz tends to contain a lot of this spatial information. So in terms of being bodies within volumes, or corporeality in space, we'll refer more to volumes of air. This hissy kind of sound, which our brain is largely processing out, there's a variety of effects, psychoacoustic effects that our brain removes so we don't hear them. But in a recording, the microphones aren't removing that hissy sound. It means that we're noticing how the sound is moving into space and also what it says about how big that volume is. Essentially, the recordings that you were just hearing, as I mentioned, are the organ is a bunch of flutes strapped together, and we're particularly interested in how the air in each of these volumes is moving into the air within the room, and that being another volume, and that there is this interplay, and that this hiss starts to show the phasing relationships between this. You may have noticed as well some of the bass, if you're listening on headphones, it comes in at about the 45-second point. So like 2 of my obsessions tend to be very low frequencies and also phase anomalies. This becomes particularly important because I'm interested in not so much the steady production of a tone as hearing the oscillations within that tone. So if you're talking in terms of orchestral production, say a violin, rather than just thinking of it as the note, as we're bowing the string, say it's 256 hertz, and so it's around a middle C, and that the way that this, if you're writing it on a staff, it's a steady tone. I'm interested in the oscillations within that, and also the different frequencies that might be produced by the resonator of the violin respective to the resonator of the room, and that these heterodyning frequencies tend to produce further spatial information. Quite often when you're recording things out of phase, you'll get maybe quite a lot of sound information in one channel, and then the other channel tends to be a lot of hiss. But when you combine the two, they produce a lot of spatial information, which is is phase information. Something that really draws those sort of things together. And a project that I undertook for quite a while in 2015 was recording in 15 of James Turrell's sky spaces. Now, this sort of draws together a lot of these ideas that the sky space is contextual. It is placed in the landscape, and also the idea that maybe what you were just listening to, you might refer to it as a soundscape. I'm trying to also draw away from the idea of using scapes, so that producing very specific outcomes. So rather than saying it's a landscape, you might say, in the case of some of the pictures that you just saw of Cornwall, that it's a variegated granite structure which is adjacent to the North Atlantic coast. Now, if I'm to speak of all those sort of things, topologically speaking, and then just reduce it to landscape, then I'm reducing all of the specificity of that information down to something that is greatly simplified. Similarly, so with the notion of soundscape, very well discussed in Tim Ingold's article, Against Soundscape, it tends to reduce things down to a visual structure. So trying to get away from that and talk about sound in its own terms, I feel that the notion of soundscape tends to produce the notion that it's an undifferentiated, amorphous movement of sound, as opposed to something that is quite tightly structured and has internal dynamics, durational dynamics, as well as timbral dynamics. So getting back to this particular project, where we're very much working with sound in the field, James Turrell's sky spaces are chambers of a fixed proportion with a aperture of a fixed proportion in the ceiling. It allows people to see the sky, and it produces an effect where the sky appears to be curved. So it's basically something that works with our perceptual psychology and how we perceive things like the sky. I'm also interested in how it removes context for the people that are sitting inside and looking out at the sky. But you can actually hear the visual context is removed, but the sonic context is not removed. So, as you can see, this is up in an alpine area. There's some clouds, there's a bit of sunshine. That sunshine and the clouds are also going to determine changes in barometric pressure, temperature, and humidity over the course of a given day or any other durational period. And that there's a volume of air within the sky space. And that there's also the outside world, which is outside the window for you as it is for me right now. And that if you are moving this volume of air in and out of the aperture, the air outside will then push the air within back in again. So if we're producing an oscillation using heterodyning frequencies, in this case I just used 2 tone generators, playing the resonant frequency of the sky space, if you're listening to the sound of the air moving in and out as motivated by 2 tones, you're going to hear 3 different things at the same time. Firstly, you're going to hear the sound of everything that's going on outside, be it birds or cows or wind in the trees, or topological shifts such as the convection of air moving up a valley and over the surrounding mountains, for example. Secondly, you're going to hear the 2 beating frequencies that I'm playing inside of the sky space as a motor to move the air in and out. And thirdly, you're going to hear a swooshing sound. This is where hiss becomes particularly important. This swooshing sound is happening in the upper region of our hearing, and it also produces a phase anomaly, and it processes the sound from outside. So as the air from outside is drawn in, then that compresses the air inside, and then it pushes it out again, and you get this exchange. And this tends to chop up the sound that's going on outside. When we layer up these sounds, and they start to process each other, and they're producing modulations between each other. And again, the hiss becomes very important. The air up in an alpine region is going to be colder and perhaps drier than in Belgium, where we're down in the flatlands, it's very humid, and it might be slightly warmer. So each air could be said to have a different tone to it, or a different sound to it. So similarly, rather than just thinking about playing a violin, and thinking of it as steady tone, if we're considering that over the course of playing a violin tone, if we were to draw that out for some minutes, the humidity might be changing, the temperature might be changing, the pressure might be changing, so that there's subtle fluctuations in the quality of that tone, as well as if we get 20 people to move their arms together in the room, you're going to notice that there's another displacement of air as well. These things are all quite subtle, but when you start to consider that the studio notion of making a recording as being quite hermetic, when you open the window, much as the same as John Cage's conversations with Morton Feldman, you're noticing that the outside comes in and that this hermetic environment is starting to be challenged. So this is partly why I'm often doing a lot of my work out in the field rather than recording strictly in the studio, because I'm interested in this way in which the environment modulates sound, and also that it's illustrative of our relationship to air. And remembering that without air, there is no us, that we would not be able to respire, we wouldn't be noticing very basic things, largely because we'd be dead. So I went to 15 sky spaces. Some of them are round, some of them are square, some of them are elliptical. Each of them has a subtly different acoustic, and I used the two tone generators to move the air in and out of the... This is the tone generator, quite a simple piece of equipment. So basically just adjusted the tones, so then the air would move in and out of the ceiling. So this has quite a subtle kind of effect. You get this oscillating sound and then the heterodyning frequencies, and you get different tones between them. So we're going to play an example now. Again, I've put some pictures in the background. It is illustrative of the places where each of the sky spaces were. Because of different copyright, there's no pictures from inside the sky space, but you can Google that if you want to. So what you're listening to is two tones, the sound outside, and then this oscillation of air, which is producing a swishing sound. And then that is gradually changing over time, because during the recordings, and you'll notice particularly around the 5-minute point, as the humidity, pressure, and temperature changes, the volume of air within the sky space subtly changes. So the two tones that produce the resonant frequency within the sky space, they too slowly change. I'm changing them myself, but it's listening to the modulation of the air within the space relative to the air outside. So we're working within an open system here, and again, specifically noticing the role of hiss. So just finally, before we go to the example, noise reduction as a concept that you might use in the studio or when you haven't close mic'd an instrument. When you use noise reduction, you're removing hiss, and with that, you're removing spatial information. So in a way, I'm drawing all of these ideas together because I'm asking you to consider not just what is sound, but like the mode in which it occurs and what that says about our mode of being within that volume of air. So the spatial aspect and the affect that that has is quite important, because you're working with a field in a way. And by using these 15 different places, I'm working in kind of a Deleuzian approach that it's rhizomatic. So I'm drawing a relation between each of these places, and that there is a relation in James Turrell's notion that he's built a mother work within the Rodin crater, which is in Arizona, and that they are related to each of the 87 sky spaces he's built around the world. So that this rhizomatic notion is actually trying to build things together in such a way that we notice how things work together, how they modulate each other, and that things aren't actually occurring in a vacuum. So we're going to go to the example now, and we'll be back in a minute. Hopefully this idea is particularly illustrative of the notion of hiss and the specificity of location and duration with regards to sound. You probably noticed in the final section with the build-up of the hiss, it's actually the wind moving through the trees. There was a storm in Brussels that was moving around the sky space. That was the one of the pictures that was in the middle of a lake. And so that the movement of the air in and out of the sky space was also processing and chopping up the sound that you're hearing moving through the trees. It's kind of like a broadband hiss. And it also, when played with the other recordings from the other sky spaces, so you're hearing up to 5 different sky space recordings played layered in a musical sense. They're cross-modulating each other and producing additional difference frequencies and overtones. A final example that I'm going to work through today draws together a bunch of these ideas. It was recorded last year in 10 locations across Poland. The Communist Manifesto referred to the concept of there being a spectre haunting Europe or moving across Europe. And it also talked about the idea that, it's commonly translated as all that is solid will melt into air, but this is actually incorrect. That the original German refers to all that is standing and that is stood will evaporate or vaporize. Within the notion of standing also refers to standing bodies. So not just the corporeality that we experience, but the corporate bodies, such as governmental and various other organizations and the buildings that they might use. So I went around to these 10 locations across Poland, starting in the north, where the Solidarity movement began in some 40 years ago, so in 1989, and finished in the south, where the Southern Solidarity movement had its base in Nowa Huta, so that's like the Newcastle of Poland. So there's a very strong political or sociocultural aspect to this. So again, appealing to the idea that sound doesn't occur in a vacuum, I'm using architectural volumes, much the same as with the Sky Space project. I'm moving the air in and out of an open window, and I'm particularly interested in the notion of these buildings and these locations that were incepted during the period between 1961 and 1989, and are now referred to as post-communist. If you were to use architecture to frame a surrounding area, and they were built with a very specific vision, then if we're to look out those same windows in the current age, what is the realization of that utopian socialist vision and how it plays out now? So again, moving the air in and out using very simple tone generators, you can hear the air moving in that area. And when we're layering up the 10 different locations, and then this was put together finally in a gallery in Budapest, which is also experiencing similar socio-political and cultural effects due to changing governments at the moment. The sound was a 6-channel installation that's also designed to move the air around in that room. So we've got a second or third order meta representation of the movement of air. So rather than just thinking of a string quartet or an ensemble playing their bows and then displacing air with their arms whilst they're also producing discretionary fluctuation of, say, 256 oscillations per second, we can think of a volume of air as itself being an instrument when it's contained as a resonator within a room, and that there's an interplay of the air within the inside and the outside. There's spatial information, the hiss, the change in the volume as the temperature, the pressure, and the temperature, pressure, and humidity shift over the course of a recording. So it's also adding a very distinct durational vector to the duration of a recording. When we combine these, we're starting to see sound as being something that's quite alive. And also it's attendant to what people, what bodies, what social organizations, what governments are doing within the adjacent and surrounding space. So that this all gives a very strong context, rather than just using tone generators and applying them together and producing a sound that is in itself hermetic. I'm interested in this, not just the mode and the node of the sound, but also how it interrogates the context within our mode of being, but also what's happening outside. So the sound that you're going to listen to now is recorded across the 10 different locations, and that you'll see some pictures from some of those locations. There was the boatyard in Gdansk, which is where the Solidarity movement began. Then there's everything from a social and cultural institution, Miasto Ogodrov, which is in Katowice, a range of other cultural institutions, some that were incepted during the period 1961 to 1989, and then were used for different purposes, and now that they're used as cultural institutions or places of learning, places for meeting. Essentially, you're listening to air as it moves around in a contemporary sense, but how it was originally posited in an architectural form. I guess it's interesting that largely when we're producing music these days, we're working indoors. So, and particularly in the Northern Hemisphere where it tends to get a lot colder. So working from those primary modes and nodes, trying to look at a way of interrogating how we exist in space or within volumes and what it says about our mutual context. So yes, you'll continue to listen to this in your own room, completely free of social connection and completely free of a direct connection between my voice and your ears. hopefully some of the considerations that I presented today can come together in a coherent way to present other ways of thinking about sound, particular emphasis on the field, which I'll speak again about in a moment, but also the notion of the context within which it occurs, not just the political context or the social context or the cultural or physical context, but also living as we are in the age of mechanical reproduction, particularly digital reproduction, as we're experiencing this lecture today in our separate rooms. When you're hearing sound in situ, it's quite different to listening to something on an album or a highly compressed video via the internet. So that there's a different depth of field between a commercial concern and producing sound in that particular context and producing something where it's a collective experience. I'm particularly interested in installations and concerts where people experience sound collectively, but also that they're experiencing sound in such a way that they are aware that they are experiencing it collectively, and that collective experience makes an impact on their individual experience. So experiencing sound as a field, which is going to have different nodes within it, and that it's where you are within that field is also going to partly reflect your own mode of being, but also a collective mode of being, and where you are in reference to those nodes are going to affect your mode. But that the field as being a fairly potent metaphor or meta-representation of how we experience the world generally, and that sound within volumes of air is part of that. The production of sound broadly, a particular interest of mine being working in the field, where we're not within a studio, it gives a broader depth of field, so that these notions of context and locational and durational markers become very important. So that a field of sound operating within a discretionary field of action that is occurring out in the field is going to affect your depth of field, and the placement of sound objects, or more particularly subjectivities within relation to sound, is going to become fairly pertinent. At a certain point, it either becomes a morass of ununderstandable nonsense, or it's kind of like a Gesamtkunstwerk or a Gestalt, which is basically surmised or comprised from all of these elements put together. Hopefully I've presented some of these notions today in a way that might encourage you to think of sound rather than just being a studio concern, something that might encourage you to go out into the field or approach your own composition with respect to the elements that are less easily delineated, be it within a score, even within a graphic score, but that there's a particular emphasis of coloration, as you hear with these things, that anything that you use is going to add color. So be it a piece of architecture or it's a acoustically muffled room, that this is a particular aspect in your own production of sound, and how any instrument that you use is producing color in that regard. These things are less easily delineated when you're writing a score and just writing it down on a staff. Particularly if you're working within digital music, you'd be aware of these, but rather than applying an effect that comes out of the box, the question of what about the parameters of this effect am I interested or not interested in? Could this be produced in a completely different set of percepts and affects if it was to be produced in a field and to produce a field, so that you're hearing a different depth of field and that the sound is moving around. So similarly, where you place microphones within that is going to be, the microphones are hearing differently to your own body, but that your corporeality is a very strong element. So when you've got your headphones on and you're making a field recording of your sound out in the field, that it's going to produce basically a reflexive process. I'd like to recommend you all to think about these rather than, sound about being an athletic endeavor where you're trying to make a certain number of notes, that the qualities of those notes and tones and sounds and how they relate not just to your own corporeality and what it is that you're either trying to express or draw people's attention to, but what it says about our collective experience as well. Thanks for your time.